You're listening to the Modern People Leader podcast, where we go behind the scenes with today's top HR leaders and work experts. We talk to them about how they've gotten to where they're at, what they do every day, and what they see coming next for the future of work. Hope you enjoy. MPL listeners, big announcement before we get into the episode. Because we had so much fun with our inaugural MPL Live event in Austin, we have decided to make MPL Live a recurring event that we do on a quarterly basis. And we've decided that our next in-person event will be in Miami on December 10th. The theme of the event will be the manager dilemma, and we've got another all-star lineup in store. We'll have 3 former MPL guests, Melanie Naranjo, who's the Chief People Officer at Athena. Shout out Melanie, she just got promoted. Dominic Boone, the VP of Talent and Org Development at Liberty Latin America, and Cleo Knowles, the Chief People Officer at SH Hotels. And then we're going to have 2 newbies to the MPL world, so brand new guests to the show. Rosanna Durthy, the VP of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at LinkedIn, and Jen Fisher, who is the former Chief Wellbeing Officer at Deloitte. It's going to be the exact same format from MPL Live Austin. We got really good feedback. People seemed really happy with the 2 hours of networking that we save after the live podcast. So if you plan on being there, I highly recommend grabbing your tickets now. We really hope that we see you guys there. This could be a fun event to fly in for, or if you are Miami based and you want to bring your entire team, shoot me a DM on LinkedIn. I can offer some group ticket pricing. But yeah, we're really looking forward to this event and hope to see you guys in Miami. Oh, by the way, the link to go register is going to be in the show notes. So just click into the show notes and you can find the link there. All right, now back to the show. Frank, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's been a while. I think the last time, or the only time really that I've seen you in person was at Transform. And I can't believe that was already 7 months ago. Like, I'm already getting the emails for Transform 2025. This year's just flying by. Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, and bringing it full circle, I was just with Samara yesterday in New York, so we'll all be together, I guess, in a couple months out in Transform.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to be here before we know it. Well, we start every episode the exact same way, and that's with something that we call good news stories. So we all go around, share something. It could be work related, could be personal, but just a way for us to start the episode with something positive and show a little bit of gratitude. And we like for our guests to go first. So if you have something, we'll let you go. But if you need some time to think about it, we can jump in.
Yeah, no, it's fairly easy for this one. My promotion was just announced this week, and there's been a outpouring of these just phenomenal messages, both in email, LinkedIn, and text. But I received a very nice handwritten note from someone, and it was a person that I think we all know, but without putting her name out there. But I just think, looking back on that messaging, it was one of those things where I thought, if my brother and my father were alive, this is something I wish I could have taken a picture of and sent to them. So, that was certainly the highlight of the week.
Well, congrats on the new role. I saw that on LinkedIn. Steven, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. So I'm going to go personal. I co-parent, and I have a 12-year-old and 14-year-old, and which is just crazy. Like, I remember when they were teeny tiny, and I was in startup mode, and Daniel was playing with them, like trying to keep them busy while they were and not wrecking the office. But now they're all grown up, and I had a bonus day this week. Their mom was traveling, so I've had them the last couple of days, and my oldest daughter, I met a boyfriend for the first time. And my good news is I didn't totally lose it. And I was able to maintain, face, nice kid. And I opened the door for him to introduce himself to me. For me, like, eye contact is important, and to shake my hand. And he took both. And that was like the first kind of check in the pro column, made eye contact, introduced himself, went straight in for a handshake, and it was a nice firm handshake, but he didn't try to rip my arm off or anything, or give me like a limp fish.
I just picture the scene from Bad Boys. You know what I'm talking about, Steven?
I don't know which one.
Go watch it
You gotta
later.
you got to go on YouTube. And
Okay,
you
I'll
watch
report
that
back. I'll report back. But yeah, so that's my good news is and everything was fine. It was a good couple of days with the daughters. So
yeah, I don't have an interesting good news story this week, which I think is the good news.
Mm.
It's just like back to normal, back to the routine, which I'm a creature of habit and I enjoy a good routine. And the last couple of weeks have been pretty chaotic with MPL Live, throwing our first event in Austin, and then last week being in Vegas for HR Tech. It's been nice, like settling back into the routine, and it'll be good to have that for at least like another like 4 or 5 weeks until we get closer to our next event. But yeah, I'm getting some much needed rest. So
Enjoy it.
yeah, I know.
I feel that we have a mutual friends between all of us that I'll call conference warriors. Like it's like, and you see them on LinkedIn, it's just like one after another. I don't know how they do it. We did our own live event, and then the next week we went to, albeit one of the largest HR conferences in the world, but man, I was exhausted. So plus one of that. And so right before we hit record, I mentioned to you, Frank, that we hadn't met before, although I feel like I know you. I think the first time that I was introduced to just your name was through a mutual friend of ours, David Landman. David and I go way back. We started very early in our careers together at Goldman Sachs in the total reward function. And so David is a close friend of mine and someone that professionally I have respected for a long time. And he was like, you got to meet this guy, Frank. He's totally nailed these CHRO dinners. And like by nailed, I mean like they're just so amazing. Like you just have to meet Frank. And unfortunately, I wasn't at Transform this year. And so it's nice to finally meet you. I'm really excited about the next question because I didn't have we haven't had a chance to connect one-on-one, and Landman really hyped you up. And so no pressure, but we want to hear your story. Like, tell us about Frank. What has your journey been in the HR world, and how has that led to you being EVP at Randstad?
Yeah, I think I'll tell a little bit of a story. I'll try to make it succinct, but also hit the key points that I think really bring it to life. But one of the things that happened to me was in my career, I was going to take a job at Morgan Stanley, and I thought that was the path for me in financial services. And they effectively told me, hey, we can't start you for 3 weeks for your program, for the training program. And in the meantime, I picked up a job on Craigslist. And 3 days into that job, which was various tasks around the office, they said, can you drive the CEO down to a speech in San Diego? And we'll give you extra money. And I thought, well, of course I'll do this. So drive down and find out it's a guy named Keith Ferrazzi, who's written a book called Never Eat Alone and incredibly well connected. And through that conversation, he asked me if I'd be willing to consider working for him and quit the job at Morgan Stanley. And 9 years later, that's what I did for 9 years working for Keith. But through that work, one of the things that I was doing was building executive communities for organizations. And I did a lot of work with Accenture. And their problem statement was really simple, which was through our largest 100 accounts, our management consulting directors, which is the most senior role, can only access, only two of those individuals can access a chief operating officer. And meanwhile, chief operating officers sign off on the largest deals. This is a problem. So I got into the business of building executive communities on behalf of other organizations. Fast forward, I get approached by HR organization, and I really wasn't sure why they wanted to even talk with me. I had zero contacts in HR, zero background, but it was because of some of my client recommendations from senior leaders. And as we got into the conversations, the problem statement was really simple. We have all these big accounts. We can't access CHROs. And I thought to myself, I think I've got the playbook for this. And so in 2015, I pulled off the very first CHRO dinner that I did. So I've been at this for close to 10 years now. And it was pretty eye-opening to me that all you really needed to do was find a compelling reason to get one person there. And before I knew it, I had 20 CHROs from the Fortune 500 sitting around a table.
Wow. Okay. So just been at this for 10 years. How would you say, like, what's the evolution been since then? So you pulled off that first dinner in 2014, got 20 CHROs to the dinner. How has it grown since?
I think I'll answer the question in two ways. I think number one, the core principles have always really remained the same for me, and that's no one shows up for me and no one shows up for Randstad. People show up for who I do the dinners with and then who else is going to be there. So I intentionally always co-produce these dinners, and if you've seen them on LinkedIn, you'll see them with thought leaders or prominent executives or leading CHROs, people like Nickel from IBM or Michael from Mastercard, and the concept there being that people really want to be able to hear insights that they can take back and leverage within their own organizations for themselves, their teams, and then they want to walk away with new relationships. So those have been always the same main tenets that I try to make sure are true to each dinner. And as I'm doing it, I'm taking copious notes throughout the evening because I want to make sure that if I can't write a thorough follow-up recap, and I know Daniel, I shared some of those with you to give you a sense of what those look like. If I can't write that email and have great insights in it, then the dinner was a failure. And if people didn't meet others and that didn't continue on, then it was a failure. So when I get a text like I got last night from an HR leader at Apple that said, "Hey, this is how transformative this was for me. I'm actually with one of the leaders from the dinner last night." That was meaningful to me. So those are some of the core concepts I think that have always been critical for me in doing those. The evolution has been that it used to be with just purely HR leaders. And since then, I've now started to think about how to incorporate other leaders. So a couple weeks ago, did a dinner with 20 CIOs, and the reality was, and then at the TED conference, did an event with 30 CHROs and 20 CIOs. And you're starting to see that a lot of these executives are working through a number of the same issues. So we can talk about that part a little bit more about why the intentionality beyond and blending those roles.
And so fast forward 2024, 10 years later, like communities, newsletters with insights, they're all that they're so in vogue. Like, and you were kind of one of the OGs that like pioneered some of these concepts in our industry. Like, from that first dinner that you had to where we are today, like what were some of the, I guess, biggest changes that you had to make to your format to kind of keep up with the times, or has it been pretty consistent over the years?
If I'm completely honest, the formats largely remain the same because I still think it's the white space that everyone is still getting wrong. I mean, I go to a lot of dinners that are not my own, and at every dinner I cringe because it's the same thing where if you come and you sat at a table where I'm hosting a dinner, you wouldn't know that you wouldn't know who paid for the dinner, you would know nothing about it. I don't talk about the organization I work for. I'm not trying to share any sort of relevant thought leadership or insights. That's not the intent. Again, the intent is really fostering a relationship across people that really don't know each other. I mean, most CHROs are very inwardly focused and have very poor external networks. That is improving as a result of all these other organizations that are putting on big conferences, but they're still weak in that place. So I think that's the one big differentiator. The other piece is a lot of these events and conferences and dinners, they want to land some points, and for me, it's not about, hey, let's have the one person land a point and then everybody goes around and acting and assuming they're smarter than the next person, and you leave this dinner with like, that was a waste of time. I'm really focused in on what are the very specific high return practices of which you can share that others can benefit from, or what are the things that you're struggling with, and let's use the people around the room in real time. And so these feel like team sessions, right? These people who went from what I would call largely strangers leave. I don't want to say they're friends, right? I think, but they go from, they're accelerating that journey from stranger to friend. And part of the way that happens is through the way that we kick the dinners off very intentionally to accelerate and rapidly increase familiarity.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been to those dinners where, I mean, you described it perfectly. You go around in a circle, everyone gives like their one insight, and I don't know how this always happens, but I always end up having to be the last person that goes. And I'm like, great. Like there's there's gonna be nothing to add after like 19 people already spoke and everybody just wants this to be over. So how do okay, so you get people to the dinner, you want to focus around a problem maybe that somebody's trying to solve. Do you have going into the dinner, is there usually somebody that like has brought you a problem? They're like, I'm trying to figure this out tonight, or does that all just happen organically through these dinners?
Two things. I think one, it happens organically because I'm doing these so often. You start to hear like what people are struggling with, and then I think to myself, who's the established thought leader? Like who's written a lot on this topic? And so I just did something with Daisy Algar Dominguez on burnout because at a CIO dinner that I hosted and a CHRO dinner the week before, both groups were talking about burnout in different ways. And the CIO group very focused on AI fatigue and burnout. And so I thought to myself, well, I know a person who just wrote a book on burnout. Like, let's do a dinner with her. And so these things happen fairly quickly. I'm trying to always think about who to bring forward. And then the other piece is it's not always done at scale. A lot of times people will share something in the room. And then this is where I think I try to embrace it as a superpower. But thinking about, hey, I heard this. I'd like to introduce you to, use let David Lamont as an example, who can help you through this. Would you be interested in that? And so I really think that's the unlock is around how can you constantly bring generosity to everything you do, bringing people together, sharing insights, putting them in front of their peers, making meaningful connections post these events so that they live on. It's not just an event; it's more than that. Those are all part of the intentionality.
Around the time that Daniel and I were launching the podcast, so this is late 2020, I read a book, and I'll have to look it up and share with you the name of the book, but it was the title of the book's The Power of Rituals. And there was something that you were saying earlier that kind of that reminded me of this book. One of the reasons that why we have all the rituals that we have in the podcast, so good news stories, rapid fire questions, one word close, came from me reading this book and saying to Daniel, like, I really feel like there need to be rituals because something magical happens when you have traditions and rituals. It's like you're giving ownership to others, because you share rituals with other people and you are sharing ownership with others. And so you're giving them a vested interest in coming back and doing it again and repeating said action. And one of the things that the author captures in the book is the power of breaking bread. And so you've taken several things that are kind of encapsulated in this book because you're breaking bread with people, which there's like something just powerful about that in itself. And you have like a ritual format. And so when I see your dinners on LinkedIn, I'm like, oh, I don't even need to see that it's a post from Frank because like the pictures look the same. Like, and so I know it's like, oh, this is one of the CHRO dinners. And how intentional have you been over the years in creating an intentional way of bringing together people, or have you just taken a more hands-off approach? Because we often, and this might segue into our next topic, which is around being of service in communities, but there's a lot of, I guess, demand. One of the things we notice is HR leaders really want to participate in micro events. And I'm just going to lump dinners into the category of micro events. And so I'm just curious, like being someone who's been doing this for literally a decade, like any thoughts on tradition and how to be intentional about creating traditions?
So 100% very big believer in the traditions, and everything really is the same from the format of 6 to 7 cocktails, introductions in a very specific way. I'll talk about that more in a second, to intentionally seating individuals. So every dinner that I will ever do, there will be a seating chart, and I try to look at people's bios in advance and think about how to meaningfully connect people with others that I think they would benefit from. If somebody already knows another person, they're definitely sitting at other ends of the table. There's a lot of thought that goes into where people sit. from the idea of there's going to be talkers and there's going to be people that just kind of sit back and are wallflowers. So my role is not to talk, but is instead to draw them into the conversations to make sure that everybody feels like they had a chance to say something. Because at a 26-person dinner, that can be tough. At a 12-person dinner, it's fairly easy. But the piece I think, and I write about this, and I've written about it a number of times, but this idea of the way you open the dinner. And so that's probably the most intentional thing that is done and the most high impact thing. And I say that because, and I'll talk about this in one second, but it's not something that needs to be done at a dinner. It's something that I think people should be doing with their teams, and I stress that. But there's a number of prompts, whether it's energy check or sweet and sour or personal professional check in, that I do at the beginning of every single dinner. And I pick which one based on the size of the group, because energy check is the quickest to get through. Sweet and sour, probably the deepest, but also can be a little bit faster. Personal professional tends to go on fairly long, and you can only accomplish that with a smaller group. But I'll give you an example of dinner where I did, and this David was at this dinner, and there was a white gentleman, 60 years old, CEO. And as I said, we're going to be more intentional about introductions real quick. Check your egos at the door. This isn't about your ego. This is about just getting a chance to know each other and taking strangers to friends. And so we're going to leverage sweet and sour as a prompt. And he kind of sat back, laughed, rolled his eyes. Now he was directly across from me. So I think there's probably about 8 people till it gets to him. By the time it got to him, he couldn't even get the words out of his mouth. The tears were just pouring out of his eyes. And what triggered that was there was a person 2 seats prior to him who said something along the lines of, I believe in the afterlife, but I struggle with the fact of never being able to hug my daughter again. Now, this white male CEO happened to have 3 daughters and started thinking about that. And so it just elicited an emotional response. Now, I would say that's unique, but it's not. Another dinner that David joined, and some of your former colleagues, without saying the name of the bank, but a culture which I think people don't get a chance to share what's going on personally with their teams. 2 of those individuals couldn't get through without an immense tears. Now, it's not always like that. People share deep things that they would never share, probably with their friends, like an individual who showed lifted up her sleeve and showed that she'd slit her wrist and had tattooed above it around how work would never, she'd never allow work to burn her out again. And so people share these wildly deep, meaningful things that are incredibly intimate that some people don't share with their family and friends. And seeing that happen in real time, I think I'm spoiled in a way because it's not as earth shattering to me, but the feedback I get after these dinners is mind blowing because people say, how in the world does this happen? And I think it's because I lead with it. So I would lead with something that's happening very deeply personal for me and take the risk. And I think back to the first time I did it, was pretty scared. Now it's never produced. I just think about what is really draining my energy right now, or what's like pretty shitty. It's for me. And maybe in the grand scheme of life, it's for many people, they might be first world problems, but it's what's bothering me, and so I share them, and it gives people the permission to do the same.
Yeah, and Stephen briefly mentioned that this earlier, but that was, the thinking around having good news stories. We've had very similar experiences with that prompt, and it's supposed to elicit very positive responses, but we had one guest who was like, honestly, I'm struggling to think of a good news story. My mom just passed away. And that episode, it was supposed to be an hour. It ended up being like 2.5, 3 hours. But yeah, there is something there, like creating these moments where people feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable. And we're trying to create that same experience at these events that we're now throwing. And one of my friends who runs a similar but different type of company was giving me some advice on prompts that we could use for the networking session, because we are doing something similar to that where we give people prompts, and similar to energy check or sweet and sour, but a little bit different. But one of the questions that he recommended that we asked that we didn't end up asking was, are you happy right now? Like everybody going around, and I was honestly like pretty nervous, and that's why we didn't include it this first go around. But it's something that's on my mind that we could have as like a, initial prompt going into like the networking, because I don't know, I just feel like that'll create real connections and not like the very like surface level like, oh, I'm doing good.
Yeah.
But
I might even offer a reframe of that. What should be, what's not allowing you to be as happy as you can be? Because
yeah.
people inevitably are not willing to go and share, right? Like what's bothering them. And so it's that, like that question of, how are you doing? "Oh, I'm doing well," but they're not, right? And so how are you really doing? And I think if you give them the prompt of to kind of lead them to what isn't going well for you right now, you're sort of opening that possibility for them.
Yeah, it's like giving them permission to not have to be okay,
Yeah.
because society makes us feel that way. And so I want to keep moving. There's some other things that we want to talk to you about, Frank. And so the I want to go into the topic of being of service. This is something that hits close to home for me. In 2013, after my first business had failed, my marriage had failed,
Mm.
social networks had evaporated on me. I was lost. Like, this was my third life crisis. Like, it wasn't my midlife crisis because I was in my 30s, but it certainly was a crisis. And I explored a lot of various things to supplement the pain and suffering that I was going through. One of the things, and I got this kind of through the 12 step world, is being of service and really offering service to others without anything in return. And so when this came up as a topic, I was like, oh man, I love this topic. And so tell us about how you practice this in your day-to-day life and how this affects the type of leader that you are.
Yeah, a lot I can say on this. So, I think so. My belief is that practicing generosity in leadership or in life, it can be done in so many ways, and oftentimes it's the smallest actions that have the greatest impact. And so, when it's not something that's been over engineered, where it feels contrived, and I think a lot of people have written about this, right? It's like you can do these small things, and then you do them, and you realize the impact that it had, and then you try to scale it, and then it's not as meaningful. And so, I do it, but the simplest thing is really just listening, right? That's the basic core to it. I think a lot of times we're on calls and we're with somebody and we're not really listening. We're listening for what we're going to say next instead of just sort of taking in what they're saying. And so at an early stage in my career, I would do just such simple things. Like someone would say to me, actually, I can't make a call next Thursday. It's my wedding anniversary. I would immediately put that in. And I don't use Outlook anymore, but I would stick that in my Outlook calendar. And it would be, oh, it's my son's birthday. And then the next year, it was so easy for me to just write a little email that said, "Hey, happy birthday to your son. Hope you guys are doing something fun." Or, "Oh, hope you guys are having a phenomenal dinner for your anniversary tonight." And this became just like a 5 to 10 of these emails I would do every day. And so I go back to this idea of like, number one, I think generosity can be considered a selfish act because quite often we feel better doing something for people than they feel. So I personally derive a lot of joy from being generous. I've had people say to me, "Don't you feel like sometimes people take advantage of you, right? You've got like all these people that come to your dinners and never bought anything from you." That's fine. I'm not in it for that, right? Like I am a firm believer that, and if you do the right things enough times with the right people, you're going to get to outcomes. And if you don't, I'm completely okay with that. And I think people have to embrace that. People who fail are sort of they lead with this idea of like, oh, let me try it out. Let me think if I can be more generous. But they're constantly thinking about what they're going to get in return, and they keep score. And so, in Keith Ferrazzi's book Never Eat Alone, chapter 2 is don't keep score. Right? And it's the idea of if you're going to be a generous person, you have to be authentically generous. Otherwise, it's artificial, and people sense that out very quickly. So for me, I think about this how I can do it personally, whether it's listening for people, struggles or challenges they're having, and if there's a doctor I can recommend, or really anything. Professionally, it's about, well, this is where I can help people quite often. If a CHRO is talking about something that they're struggling with, I've probably spoken to another CHRO that's gone through this, or willing to help and have those conversations. So I set a goal of making at least 5 virtual introductions each week. Now, most weeks I exceed that, and some weeks I don't, and so I don't hold myself that accountable to it either, right? It's I want those to feel authentic. If I do five for the sake of doing five, I'm going to make three shitty ones one week. And so the idea is, how do I make as many meaningful introductions professionally for people? And then again, if I go back to listening, though, I'll tell you like a story that was really impactful for a client of mine. They were trying to get a meeting with this executive, and they couldn't figure out anything. And they called in their CEO. They couldn't get a meeting. And this is on a Saturday, like 10 years ago. I just watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos. This guy had spoken at conferences, and I picked up on this one story he was telling about going fly fishing with his son. And there was some analogy, and I don't recall what the detail was, but I just picked up on that, and I thought to myself, what if there was a book around the top fly fishing destinations in the world? We bought this book, wrote a handwritten note, and sent it from on behalf of the CEO. And so we did this and got the CEO the meeting, and the person wrote back, "This was one of the most creative ways in the fact that there was something to along the lines of like the fact that you invested the time." Now, I was doing this on behalf of someone, but if this were my own story, it's no different, right? You just look for ways that are important to someone else, not what's important to you.
There are a lot of things I want to comment on. When you were sharing how it's the little things, like if you hear that a coworker, it's their daughter's birthday, you put that in your calendar, and when the next year rolls around, you're reaching out to let them know that happy birthday to your daughter. It was little things like that at Humu, my last company, that were like the, I guess, most memorable moments of being an employee for a company like that. So like, for our anniversary or our birthday and they did like, milestones. So like 3 months, 6 months, year, 2 year, 3 year, they would send out like a little short survey to the 5 to 10 people that you interact with the most in the company
Mm.
and have them share some nice words. And the first thing that you would wake up to in the morning was a bunch of nice little notes. And the best notes were the ones where they're mentioning, like, for example, like Succession. That was a big show that all of us were watching at the time. And one of my coworkers just made like a little reference to that, because we were both in like the Slack group where we were talking about Succession. It was like, oh, like they remembered that, like, I'm a huge fanboy of that show. And then I was also gonna say I get so much joy from the calls where there's no agenda and it's somebody just trying to learn more about the podcasting space, or they're trying to learn more about marketing, or they're trying to figure out the next steps for a business that's similar. Like, I don't think I get more joy from anything else in the world than doing those calls. And I've been really thinking about how I can get more involved, or like other places I should be where I can help other people. And I kind of just like stop there. But you're inspiring me to do some homework and figure out like where I can be of service for things like that, because I imagine there are a lot of people that are looking for help with things like this. And then
I'll
the
give you
rest of
one
it,
idea if you don't mind, real quick.
I would love an idea.
I A friend of mine lost their job right before Thanksgiving last year and was really blindsided by it and struggling by it. And I thought to myself, well, I can help them, right? I mean, I work for a company that's a talent acquisition firm. I'm a person that I think is fairly versed in teaching others how to network, having done that for a lot of years. And then I thought to myself, there's probably a lot of other people that are going through this. And I put a post on LinkedIn and just said, this is a tough time. I'm seeing a lot of people that are losing jobs. And if anybody wants to schedule some time with me over the next month, I'll take as many of those calls as I can. It backfired a bit, and then I think I did about 65 calls.
Oh my god.
But the comments and not, but to your point, the feeling that you had leaving that call, but the nice messages people got when they landed a job, or for the people that I had an ability to make an introduction, just for even taking the time and making those introductions, it's a massive feeling it's a very rewarding feeling.
I think I'm gonna
I
do that.
honestly think, Daniel, that's something you get. This topic is something that you get pretty intuitively. And I say that because Daniel and I are pretty different when it comes to our approach to engaging with the market we serve. And what I mean by that is very early on, we made a decision to be transparent, like full transparency. So if you call us and you're like, hey, I heard you guys have figured out XYZ podcast sponsorships, and I would love to meet with you to learn more about that, we will take the call and we'll literally walk you through how we approach sponsorships. And that was a Daniel decision. That wasn't a Steve. I was like, like, really? We're going to give away our playbook that we worked hard to figure out to monetize podcasts, which is a really hard thing to do. And we're just going to give that away to people. And now I get it. Like, on the other side of all this, I get it, because I agree that, some of the best moments in my week are the calls that I take to not talk about business, to not further our modern people leader goals. It's brainstorming with Anna Firmanov, a marketing consultant who has asked me to give her thoughts on her new go-to-market strategy, or sharing with people tech partners how we approach social and social engagement and sponsorships. Like, there's just a lot of joy in all that. But I do believe, especially if you're older, like I'm the old head in Daniel and I's relationship. And for older generations, I think it's more of a struggle, at least in my experience. Cause I remember a day when like HR secrets were like tightly guarded secrets.
Yeah.
Like, you don't tell someone how you approach talent acquisition, because they will get the best talent. So it more of like a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset. And one thing that I really will give Daniel kudos on is having an abundance mindset. Like, no, Stephen, like, if we get others to be successful at what we're doing, we all rise. Like,
Yes.
HR podcasting will be more elevated. There'll be better content. There'll be better sponsors. Like, the more. And for me, that is just not how I'm naturally wired. Hence, I had to find that in a time of crisis. But we still have some things that we want to talk about. So I'm going to keep us moving a little bit. We added back a segment that we had for like a year plus, and then we went like a year or so without it, and we've recently brought it back. It's called The State of HR, and we thought this would be great to cover with you, because we often say, like, we talk to HR leaders all the time, like at least 2 or 3 times a week. And if there's anyone that talks to more HR leaders than we do, it's you. Because these dinners, you're doing these dinners all the time. And so I want to have some real talk about, like, where are we? What is the state of HR right now? It's, for me, continued to be confusing for the last couple of years. I've been hoping that if I go to this conference, if I go to HR Tech, like, I'm going to uncover some new thing that will make more sense of it all. But the news flash from HR Tech conference is that doesn't exist. Like, I actually left HR Tech conference this year with more questions than answers. And so, given your access, given you the conversations you're having, let's just start broad. Like, what is the state of HR in your opinion right now?
Yeah, I mean, this in terms of topics that I'm hearing most about that are continuing to come up.
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think this isn't HR specific. I think I shared before at a few CHRO dinners and CIO dinners. Burnout is coming up a lot more than it was. I mean, it was coming up during COVID, took a pause, and it's coming back up now. I think when I do dinners that include DEI leaders, there's a massive, I think, disappointment in terms of all the organizations that are pulling back on the commitments they made. So we're seeing a lot of that. There's certainly, I think there's AI fatigue with AI optimism at the same time. You can hear one CHRO so thrilled about their accomplishments and what they're doing, and then the next one talk about just how limiting it is because their general counsel is blocking any sort of use of it, even though they've developed what they believe to be safe use cases that will drive efficiencies. So I don't think, I wouldn't say that it's anything net new. The main thing that I'd say is it's interesting is that like everybody has got a little piece of it where they're doing it better than the other. And this, going back to your scarcity and abundance mindset, the part that I'm trying to drive is, hey, if we can help all tides rise together, and let's say like MasterCard, you're doing this phenomenally, and IBM, you're doing this phenomenally, and we could sort of create the playbook together, there would be rapid advancement. But while I think IBM is a leader, particularly in what they're doing for AI and HR, not all organizations can take and use what they're doing, and they're not necessarily giving that away, they're selling it. So there's a number of different ways I think organizations can get better at this. And then the spirit of not only the dinners, but these larger summits that I do, one I'll be doing in December where I'm bringing CHROs and CIOs together. The intent is, if you show up at this, it's not to pound your chest and talk about how good you are. We do it under with a brand of radical innovators. And that means we are here to only talk about things that are going to meaningfully transform the future and make employees' lives better. And if you don't have a either specific idea or practice on that, we do tell people it's almost like you got to shut up, because you get people in the room that sort of stand up and they want to talk for 5 minutes and they want to hear themselves talk. And we say, I didn't hear the practice in that. So let's move on. And it's really forcing people to be specific. So that's in terms of like what I'd say is the state of like the key topics. I think it's this balance though, in terms of what I'm seeing around optimism, skepticism, burnout. And again, it's almost like it's hard to say that you see so many, and I think there's people that have carved out this brand on LinkedIn where they're sort of invoke all this emotion by posting something negative, and then they get everyone to pile on. And I think unfortunately there's too many of those people right now, and those are the people that get all the likes and all the comments. And so those are the people that I wish sort of would fade away, and people would stop engaging in their content, because there's too much good stuff up there around specific best practices that people can leverage, other ways that you can help empower and elevate employees in the workforce. And so I think that's the balance is how do you draw more people away from what's easy to fall into, which is that skepticism and negative group, and bring them over to the optimistic side.
And I imagine this happens in real life at dinners where, some people naturally just gravitate towards the more pessimistic views. And this is something we've talked about a lot early on with the Modern People Leader. We saw two paths. We could either go like the sensational route and try to like have, like the buzziest headlines and like really focus in on the negative, because there is a playbook for growing a podcast really fast that way. Or we could focus on the positives and the best practices and just trying to share as many diverse perspectives as possible, oftentimes conflicting perspectives, but everybody's like, trying to achieve the same thing. And that just feels so much more rewarding. So I'm curious, like, whenever that does happen at a dinner, and I don't know if this does happen, but like, how do you quickly like redirect the conversation and turn it into something more positive?
Yeah, it's tough. The reality, you don't want to be rude, right? And that's the challenge. But there are times where you have to interject and cut people off, and I usually try to orient that by going back to what I say at the very beginning of the dinner, which is that if you don't walk away with new relationships, and if you don't walk away with actionable insights that you can leverage, then this night's a failure. And so I have to get get the train back on the tracks. And I usually just use that as a way to say, there's a reason why I'm pivoting. Here's why, because we can complain about a topic all night. What good is that going to do? So that's usually it does happen. Absolutely. Sometimes it's easier to jump in and pivot, and other times it's not, depending on the nature of the topic and the person who is expressing that point of view. And then of course, because it's in evening, that tends to have a lot of wine going, depending on how much they've consumed and what state of mind they're in. So I've seen various states of this. I actually had a very, very challenging experience at the Unleashed conference where I hosted a dinner, and a very senior HR leader with much more tenure than another person who was there took a opposing point of view and was fairly direct in that, and then said, "Okay, sweetie, you'll figure it out." And in that moment, I was so blown away. I didn't know what to do, and if I could have had a redo, I would have called that out in the moment. And it was honestly a failure of mine to not do that, to let that happen at a dinner where I'm the host. But again, I've not perfected this. I'm learning. I learned that day that shit, I should have done something much different. I shouldn't have allowed that to happen. These are all my guests, And in that moment, I let one of my guests down. So yes, it happens. How do you get it back on track? I can't say I've perfected that, right? I think I'm doing an okay job of it, and it's something that as I sure hope doesn't happen often, it will, and I need to think about that.
So it's October 4th. Obviously, this podcast will be released much later, but I'm guessing it will be, we're nearing an election, and I'm guessing that the podcast will be released around the time the election is actually happening or may have just happened. Is this something that is front of mind for the HR leaders you're talking to? And I bring this up in the context of what we've been talking about the last few minutes. The divisiveness does exist, and the reason why I'm now connecting it to politics is this is Huertonomics. This isn't rooted in any kind of factual data, but it feels very similar. The divisiveness in our HR community feels and the way that we are engaging with each other on social media, on LinkedIn, it it started to feel very similar to some of the political conversations that I have also observed on the same platform and other platforms. And so I'm just curious if this is something that's even coming up in the CHRO dinners, or any thoughts that you have on the topic, the notion of HR programs or practices being labeled as woke or politicized, and there being traction, the same driving force that results in a negative position driving clicks. I think that is the same driving force that is creating this forcing us down this political path.
Either, Stephen.
Man, I've been trying to say it for weeks now, and I'm like, I need to find a new thing that I'm obsessed with. But I think you understand where I'm going, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, few points to that. So the first is, does it come up? Yes. More through the lens of civility and how can we help create policies that allow for more civil conversations. So we did some work at the TED conference in partnership with SHRM. I think SHRM has done some decent stuff there, but we were basically trying to say, hey, let's not try to create this as some outside agency. Let's instead build this with 30 CHROs in the room. And so we have been co-creating a policy with some of the largest companies in the world. Walmart, Donna Morris was there, down to other organizations, right? So we had a large group, and they're working on that. Now, I'm not a big believer in this, transparently, right? I think people are going to do unless their jobs at risk, like those individuals that did a sit-in at the Google offices, where they sat in at TK's office, and the next day Google did do the right thing, I think, and by letting those individuals go. I think it's a little bit too much to try to police all of that, and it's fairly unrealistic. So what I'm more focused in on is, what are the things that CHROs can do post-election to try to minimize that noise, and how can you not have to take a stance on every single thing, right? And I think you see this now, where organizations are forced to take a stance and then sometimes have to pull back because it was made in haste. So the dinner that I'm actually doing in New York on November 7th with a smaller group of 12 global CHROs is specifically focused in on that topic, which is, what are some of the implications as a result of the election, assuming all the results are in by then? And so the reality is, I don't want to come off and have a point of view. I don't think any one individual can, but we'll use this as a meaningful way to drive a conversation for how these people who have massive workforces can and should be thinking about it.
Well, after the dinner, you'll have to forward over the notes from the key takeaways from that dinner, because this is something that I think everybody's trying to figure out right now. So one last question before we move to rapid fire. Done, I'm guessing, hundreds of dinners at this point. Maybe, I don't know if you've reached 1,000 yet, but
Not
you've done
yet.
these dinners. And, some as recently as this week, it sounds like. What, I guess before I ask the question, occasionally we'll have somebody on the show who says something and I'm thinking about said thing for the next like 4 weeks before I go to bed, on every podcast we're doing afterwards. Like that one thing that they said, that one little nugget, like I can't like get out of my head, and it forces me to think a little bit differently. Has there been a moment like that here in the last couple of weeks? Anything you want to share from one of your recent dinners where either somebody said something that really challenged the way that you think, or just like, kind of brought something to light that wasn't even on your radar?
Yeah, so I had a great week in that I happened to be with two prominent speakers, and Will Guidara, who wrote Unreasonable Hospitality, and Adam Grant, who's written several best-selling books. And both of them have messaging that I believe is very aligned to my core, which is around leading with generosity, focused on creating memorable moments for individuals. Will talks a lot about this. One of the things that stuck out to me, though, was Will talked about how there's nobility in service. And I think there's people that sort of, if you've never worked in a restaurant, and I did at a very early age. If you haven't, there tends to be this perception, and I don't want to say this is universal, but people tend to maybe look down on that profession a little bit. And I think more broadly, he was getting at the point there's just nobility in service. And someone who was in the room in one of our breakouts was a note taker and made a joke and said, I don't know if I can comment because I'm the note taker. And I said, well, hold on, there's nobility in service right there. I was like, we can't, number one, allow that to happen, right? And so that's been sticking out of my head, is because I'm blessed to have a support team, and I think I do a good job of recognizing them for the work that they do, but I could probably do it more and do it more often and in a more meaningful way. And so that was really sticking out in my head, was that if I want to create all of these high impact moments and show that I care about people, it's got to be everybody. It needs to be the people internally, externally. It needs to be my children, my wife, who was going to the refrigerator earlier on in this episode. And so it needs to go to everyone in my life. And so I think I'm good at it, but at the end of the day, better never stops.
I love that. And like all the other topics we've talked about today, I feel like we could easily just dive into that and spend another 30 minutes. But unfortunately, Frank, we're at that point of the conversation where we need to turn the corner and bring this to a close. But before we do that, we have a couple more traditions. The next one is a ritual we call rapid fire questions. Same set of questions we ask every guest. You ready to do this?
Let's do it.
Awesome. First question, if you could go back in time and talk to a 22-year-old Frank, what career advice would you give yourself and why?
Probably putting a greater focus on relationships. I think I did a phenomenal job at it by the time I turned 30, but I came from a very poor, uneducated family in an incredibly wealthy, privileged town. And if I had only been more intentional about building those sorts of relationships and extracting insights from those individuals, I maybe could have increased the velocity behind my own career. And then I am I'm terrible at comparing myself to others. I work on this all the time. But I think it was the comparison's the thief of joy. I try to remind myself of that because the reality is I had to go to school full time while working full time, and so I didn't graduate at the same time as people, and that felt like I was less than others. And so I think those couple things: don't compare yourself to other people. Put a big focus on relationships, because that's what really matters.
I agree. That's not something that I focused on until maybe a few years ago, but that's great advice. All right, next question. If you could fix any HR or people problem with a magic wand, what would it be and why?
Pay equity drives me. I have a daughter, two daughters, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and to think that they're going to go and do the same job as a male and get paid less is disgusting. The fact that someone's skin color and racial and there's a number of different reasons that can do the exact same job and better and get paid less makes no sense. And so that would be the first thing that I would just say, let's fix this. And because it should be the easiest thing to fix, yet you hear projections that it won't be fixed for 50 years, and it blows me away.
It's insane. I'm also a girl dad, and it drives me crazy. And I've had to spend a lot of time like, why did it take that to resonate with me being a girl dad? But it is at the front of my mind as well. next question. When you look around the corner to the end of 2024, which, geez, is right around the corner, and beyond, what do you see coming next for the future of work?
So I don't believe in AI taking jobs, and I think a lot of people now talk about this more actively, that AI plus people is going to be the real unlock. Adam spoke about this. Adam Grant spoke about this a little bit yesterday at our conference. Part of the work stream that we're doing out of the work we brought together CHROs and CIOs at the TED conference was for that exact reason. I think the unlock is going to happen through that being a more critical partnership. And part of what we're looking at with a number of big organizations is let's not feel like you need to start and boil the ocean. Let's instead pick one role in your organization. Let's blow the whole thing up and pixelate it with AI. What is every single task that can be done with AI, and what's every task that makes that individual a better leader, a better performer? And let's rebuild that role, start that, and scale it. And so that'll be the focus of the work we have coming up in December. And I think more organizations are really leaning into this and then certainly established thought leaders like Adam doesn't hurt the message.
That's super interesting. And I feel like a lot of, just based off of all of the vendors that we met last week, it feels like the initial use case is managers, but I like the idea of going like function by function and like really blowing it up and figuring out all of the ways that you can apply AI to the different work streams. Next, your last question in rapid fire: who do we need to bring on next? Like, if you had to give us, and I know this is probably a very difficult question for you to answer because you have such an extensive network, but who are the few names that you think we should bring onto the show?
This might be recency bias, but it is recency bias. But Will Guidara would be phenomenal. I mean, I took so many pages of notes of the examples, the stories, and I saw him speak at World Business Forum last year, and I had the same number of pages of notes. And I thought to myself, I probably only did 2 or 3 of these things. And I'm like, now this year I'm going to do 2 or 3 more of these things. And it's just such amazing, simple concepts that if you do these for the people in your lives, you'll have such a great impact. And I think you'll have more joy. And so while he doesn't necessarily have content that is intended to be for HR, it's incredibly relevant I think it's relevant for everybody. And then let me see, an HR leader, would that be helpful? An HR? I just love everything that Walmart and Donna Morris does for people. I think they get a lot of negative press. I don't think they get enough good for all of the great things they do to empower employees, including free education programs through Guild and all the other things that they do for upskilling and reskilling and growing people in their careers. So she might be a harder person to get, but she'd be an awesome one to get.
Well, I don't want to jinx it, but we shot our shot like
Good.
a couple weeks ago, and it's looking promising. So hopefully we'll have Donna on the show very soon.
Awesome.
Cool. So let's move to our last tradition, which is called one word or phrase close. We all respond with whatever is coming to our mind. It could be anything. It could be one word.
One word.
It could be a few.
Gratitude, and thank you guys for having me on.
I'm gonna go with. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Steven.
I'm gonna go with service.
I'm gonna say generosity and abundance.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. Well, Frank, this has been a long time coming. I know we've had friends of friends, and Daniel met you at Transform, and so stoked that you finally agreed to join us and we got you on the show. It's been an absolute blast. You're part of our community now. Yeah. And I just have to think there's some way we combine the forces of like a Frank dinner and an NPL. Like there's some way I feel like there's other collab opportunities out there for us. And so hopefully you'd be open to either coming back or doing something a little different with us. But
let's do it. That's awesome. I love it.
All right. Have a great weekend, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Modern People Leader. We really, really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating. It would mean the world to us. And connect with us on LinkedIn. We want to know what you think about the show, and you can find links to both of our profiles in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and see you on the next episode.